Good morning, I'm WaywornWyrm, and welcome to my channel. And welcome to Astra Imperia, Episode 2, Growing Pains. Holly looked at the small dining room as she ran and was content, even proud if she let herself be completely honest. She had very quickly become the director of operations for the place when it became clear that, of the 4 managers, she was the one who knew what they were doing the most. She was equal in status to the head chef and answered only to the general manager. With one last look, she sighed and walked out the side door into one of the many hallways crowded with people. It was time to make her way home for the day. She lived in a nice studio apartment, but with her new position, she would have to move soon. Apparently, the Colonial Council was saving apartments like hers for those who couldn't afford to pay rent. As the director of operations for a decent-sized restaurant in one of the busier areas of the city, she was considered able to pay rent. Although, she was going to stay in her current place for as long as possible to save as much as she could. She remembered the few people who had tried to get her to be a part of their meetings on the Airbus, and how disappointed they must be now. They were hoping that in this new colony they could do away with things like money and wealth, and everyone could share and share alike. Sure, for interplanetary business, at least until everyone else was on the same page as them, money would still have to exist on that scale. But why should it exist on any smaller scale? At least, that's the question they kept asking. It's not what they were going to be getting, however. Housing had a set subsidy, which made many places like Holly's free. Food also had a set subsidy, which was enough to eat well enough to not complain on. Air was free. Water was the only thing that really was controlled, but the prices weren't high enough that anyone would feel like they were left out. And if you didn't have a job, you can go get one doing work on maintenance or expanding the city. The government made sure there was openings to make sure that everyone who wanted a job had one. And anyone who didn't want a job would get enough to survive on, if not thrive. These thoughts of politics and economics brought her all the way to her door before she even realized it. It wasn't that she disagreed with the people on the trip over. It was more that she didn't feel like she could make a difference. What could one waitress do to change something as large with as much inertia as a government? Well, not waitress. Not anymore, at least. Sure, she was a director now, but honestly, it was a rather small place, and she didn't really have any more power or influence than she had had as a waitress. Opening her door and entering her apartment, these thoughts flew out of her head as she walked over to the couch and plopped down. While this place wasn't much bigger than the place she had been living on back in Owei, it was much nicer. Everything was newer and worked. The area of the city that she was in was also nicer and not crime-infested. She didn't have to worry about being mistaken for a sex worker on her way to or from her house. On top of all of that, there was so much more stuff than when she left. She had only lived here for a surprisingly short amount of time, but her paychecks in her new position were so much larger than before that she could afford to get enough to make her house a home. As cheesy as that sounded. When everyone first got sent to Ailea, they were assigned residences and jobs according to what it was assumed that they would be able to afford and or fit well in. Turns out, the assigners of these positions were quite wrong, so there was a lot of moving going on. Some people were like Holly, and getting promotions and or larger residences, but the opposite was also true. It was assumed that in a few months things would mostly calm down and everyone would settle into a new equilibrium that everyone could live with. Looking at the news, Holly saw the same main stories that had been plastered all over everywhere for the last month. After the exploration ship Prometheus had completed its scans of Ailea, and this large colony was created, it had moved to start exploring the moons of the gas giant Leonov, and found that the moon Thoros was beyond wildest expectations. It was well known for a long time that Thoros might have life on it. It's close enough to Leonov that the tidal forces could have heated the moon, and apparently they do. It had an atmosphere that was thicker than Owei's, made mostly of carbon dioxide, which was breathable, but apparently not the most comfortable. Somewhere between half and 80% of the moon was covered with water. It was full of minerals to mine, and it had prolific amounts of native life. Or at least that's what all the newscasters were saying. It seemed like discoveries on Thoros were made every couple of seconds. And with the government announcing that colonization was currently halted due to the strain that moving 13 million people in the space of 2 months to 2 different colony worlds, when before nothing of that scale had ever been tried, the news was full of stuff about Thoros. Every now and again there'd be a story about Ailea, but since the world was lifeless, these stories were mostly interest pieces about how the colonists were adapting to their new lives. And the problem with these stories is they didn't capture the imagination like rough and tumble colonists living outside in a world teeming with unexplored life did. Compared to Thoros, Ailea seemed a bit too sterile. Or at least that's the impression that one got from watching the major news networks on Owei. There were a couple of companies trying to start news stations on Ailea, but they had not gotten off the ground yet. As for news stations on Thoros, those would probably be much farther down the road. What with those rough and tumble colonists needing to figure out how to survive and not get killed. And the deepest recesses of her mind, that place where no one really likes to acknowledge exists, Holly suspected that the reason why the amount of colonists to Thoros was so much smaller than those to Ailea, and why the government stopped all colonization after just a couple of trips to Thoros, was because 2 million people were expendable. Even though the planet was much more inviting to colonists, Holly was sure that Thoros had a much higher risk of failure than Ailea had. If Ailea failed, it would be because of a relatively small list of reasons. Most of them fixable. If Thoros failed, well, they didn't even know all the possible reasons yet. Grunting in disgust at herself, Holly flipped off the news and got up to do something. After a few seconds of flailing around trying to figure out what to do, she settled on making dinner. By the time she was putting the finishing touches on her flatbread, she had decided that she was going to take a break from watching the news. She did not want to spend any time in that dark recess of her mind, and apparently thinking about Thoros put her in that spot. And considering how Thoros was all over the news right now, clearly the best course of action was to not watch the news. At least until other stories started to dominate the press. That shouldn't take too long, should it? Sitting at her table and taking the first bite of the aromatic food, she convinced herself it wouldn't be too long. By the second bite, she had completely moved on from that train of thought. She was only thinking about the flatbread and the chef who taught her how to make it. Admiral Culfuray was enjoying a nice steak dinner in one of the commissaries aboard the orbital shipyard above his home planet, trying to both enjoy his meal and being polite to the journalist who was in front of him asking him all of the questions. He had to be polite because it was the journalist's organization who was buying the meal, and to be fair to the poor man in front of him, it wasn't his fault he didn't know what he didn't know. Abram Paredes was sitting placidly with the recorder between the two men as he considered what to ask next. I would like to talk about the Munswell next. It is my understanding that it is your flagship, as it is the largest ship in the fleet. Correct. In fact, it is 2.5 times larger than the Charon class, which is the only other class of military ship we have actually built. There are several classes that exist on paper, but the Munswell and the Charon class are the only two that have been built. Is it true that the Munswell is considered a frigate? Culfuray looked up at Abram, his fork halfway to his mouth, butter dripping from the bite of steak. Sadid deliberately set the fork back down on his plate and slowly straightened up. He had an idea where this line of questioning would go, and he was not sure he liked it. Yes, the Munswell's class is a frigate. I assume your next question will be, why is it considered a frigate when it is by far the largest spaceship with weapons we have built? In short, there are 3 main reasons for that. The first reason is that at 5,000 tons of displacement, it's roughly the size of a sea-based frigate. The second reason is that it was built for the role that a frigate has in a seaborne fleet. And lastly, there's a list at headquarters with the designations of each kind of spaceship and how they are intended to be used and how they should be built to facilitate these roles. Frigates are ships between 2,500 tons and 5,000 tons and are designated to be support ships in a fleet. They're designed to operate as single ships within the fleet, and their armament is mainly broadside-based. This has 2 differences from destroyers, which are designed to operate as part of destroyer packs within a fleet. Destroyers also have front arc-based weapons, as well as spinal-mounted weapons. The Munswell is not currently acting as a frigate, as there are no ships for it to support. It currently fills the role of a battleship, as in a fight it would act as the main ship of the line. Before you ask, Charons are corvettes that are currently acting as cruisers, which are smaller and more lightly armored and armed than battleships, and act as the rest of the ships of the line. Interesting. You've used the term ship of the line twice now. What do you mean by that? City nodded. This was a question he was expecting. Generally, there were 3 ways a conversation about the Space Navy would get to this point. He had an answer for all 3 of these ways. Yes, I will answer your question, but first I want to talk about some other related things. There are currently 6 ships that are military ships, and let's focus on commanding officers for a second. Commanding the Munswell, there is me, Admiral City Culfuray. Commanding the Prometheus, there is Captain Elbe Merek. Equinox has Captain Sabiso Hobbs. The Charon is commanded by Commander Bridget Ayux. Commanding the Anthraxus is Commander Colonel Rutherford. And finally, we have Commander Theory Radcliffe commanding the Bubonics. If you look at the Republic's water-based navy, you will find many more officers, including entire ranks that are missing from the upper command of the Space Navy. Generally, that would be cause for concern, but space warfare is completely different than water-based warfare. Even more than in the obvious ways. There are 3 dimensions, but that's not as big of a deal as you might think. Firstly, there's a surprising amount of 3-dimensionality in water-based naval warfare. And secondly, we are creatures that fundamentally think in 2 dimensions, so all of our simulations indicate that commanding officers tend to pick 2 dimensions as the ones they're going to deal with, and mostly forget about the third. The bigger difference is in the warfare itself. Modern water naval activity is generally all about missiles fired miles away from the target, and aircraft that are similarly far away when they take off and make their attacks. The bigger difference is in the warfare itself. Modern water and naval activity is generally all about missiles fired miles away from the target, and aircraft that are similarly far away when they take off and make their attacks. This is not true for the Space Navy. We have not figured out yet how to create a missile or torpedo equivalent, and our lasers suffer from both how accurately can our computers target, and from the inverse square law. What that fundamentally means is that space warfare does not look like modern naval warfare. It looks very similar to naval warfare in the time of cannons. It's one of the reasons why I was picked to be the admiral to lead the Space Navy. I was a naval historian as well as an acting admiral. The main way that ships battled back then was that the biggest ships on each side would form a line, and the lines would maneuver and fire at each other as a line. Ships that were large enough to be part of that battle line were called ships of the line. City stopped and took stock of Abram for a moment. I fear that I'm boring you, good sir. Let's enjoy this meal and speak of other things. We can continue this conversation at a future date. Abram nodded his assent, reaching forward to turn off his recorder and slid it back into his pocket. He began to eat his own meal at this point. It was a nice lamb meal with green beans and mashed potatoes. He was writing a series on the Space Navy now that the Navy was starting to see it as a real thing and that the colonization of other planets had begun. He had figured that he would have more material than could go into a single write-up when the interview or interviews were finished, so he was more than fine stopping now. The Admiral had both cleared up several things, as well as mentioning several things he would expand on later, such as the similar yet different way he seemed to treat missiles and torpedoes. As far as Abram knew, they were almost two completely different things. Elba rubbed her bleary eyes. Another month, another moon. The Icarath system only had 4 planets, but Leonov, the only gas giant, had 34 moons. Between the other 3 planets, there were another 3 moons, for a total of 37 moons in the solar system. Each science ship could completely map and survey 2 moons a month. Between the 2 of them, it had taken close to 9 months to get to where they were. Almost done. The distance between the moons was almost trivial, so that didn't really factor into the time, which, at first, sounds like it would be a good thing. But Elba wished that there was more time spent traveling that lasted more than about a day. She could use the rest. Looking up at her bridge crew, it looked like all of them could use a rest. She thought back to Ailea, the excitement she had at first stage, at each first. Now each stage was the 14th time they've done that stage. Sometimes, like on Thoros, there was life, even complicated life. Sometimes, like on Ailea, there was no life. Sometimes the moon was rich in minerals that were important, sometimes not so much. Plenty of alien life was found. Lieutenant Commander Kastner was always the hardest to get to leave a planet. He was quickly becoming the preeminent exobiologist. Although, to be fair, there wasn't much other competition in that field. There was Lieutenant Commander Mitten Bystrom, the science officer for the Equinox, and then the team of biologists on Thoros, but that was it. Lieutenant Kastner had the largest collection of biological samples, not from Owei, that had been ever collected, and one of 2 that had samples from multiple bodies. In fact, once the bioscans were complete enough to indicate life on a moon, Kastner insisted that they land the ship long enough for him to leave with a team to begin collecting samples, leaving Lieutenant Helena Davies, the second science officer, in command of his department for the rest of the scan. Elbe didn't mind doing that for him, truth be told. It generally only took a couple of hours and kept the helmsman sharp, and he was creating history by collecting the samples and studying them. Beyond all of that, it meant that Lieutenant Davies was getting plenty of time as acting head of the science department on the ship, which would look great on her service record when it was time to lay down another Prometheus class. When she thought about it, a lot had happened in the 9 months that they had been scanning the moons. It just generally didn't feel like it, because most of the time was spent waiting on the computers to collect data, and then parse the data. All her crew did in those moments was make sure the computer was correct and decide what that data meant. It took about 2 weeks to fully scan a moon, and they had done it so many times that by now the ship was a well-oiled machine. Well, At least the bridge crew and the science department. Engineering and security did not have much to do. Lieutenant Commander Ijiro Coyote, her tactical officer, had told her that they had been running simulations almost non-stop with the security teams, both for space battles and for boardings. In case they were ever boarded, it would be easy for the security team to know what to do, which was good. Or if they found themselves in a space battle, where they could not run to the First Fleet for some reason. That probably counted as a well-oiled machine. As for engineering, they were also running drills and keeping up with the minor maintenance a ship like the Prometheus needed. Although, with the ship still being so new, it did not need as much maintenance as it would in 10 or so years, meaning that there was less for engineering to do. Not that that was an issue. Well, soon they'd be done with the moons of Leonov, and would be on to the inner two of the asteroid belts that encircled the system. She was not sure how they would do that yet, but it was exciting to plan on it. And once they were done scanning the asteroids, they would test out the faster-than-light engines that all ships had, but had never been used. They would chart a course to the Voab system, located only 3.16 light-years from Icarath. Once there, they would at least roughly map the system and head home. Much of the details of what she would do on her mission were left up to her by Admiral Culfuray, due to the fact that she would be completely out of communication, and they did not have the best information about the system. Probably roughly a month after they left, the Equinox was set to head to another system the same distance away from Icarath. But the two systems were just under 5.1 light-years from each other. This would mark the beginning of another era for her people, as they left their home system and started exploring and eventually colonizing other star systems. That was part of what kept her going in moments like this. In just a couple of months, she would be commanding the first ship to ever leave Icarath. Well, the first recorded ship. She still didn't believe that hogwash about being descended from a group from a different world or any of that bullshit. Owei's biology fit together far too perfectly, and life could have easily formed from the components on the planet. But, if you did believe that horseshit, then the Prometheus would still be the first recorded ship to ever leave Icarath. But all of that was in the future. For now, she was still sitting on the bridge, watching as various readouts spooled data. Cleothea, the moon they were currently surveying, was small, only about 72 kilometers in diameter. It orbited Leonov at roughly 2,228,453 kilometers. Well, on average. Or just a little over 7 light seconds from the planet. For its size, it had an abundant supply of useful radioactive minerals and industrial use minerals. She was sure that eventually a small mining colony would be placed on this moon, but it was going to be pretty low on the list, especially since Ailea was proving to not be as prosperous as it was hoped. In the excitement and initial rush to found an interplanetary colony, claiming all the rocky planets in the system, a big push that set a fairly large colony on Ailea, only to later find Thoros and a few of Leonov's other moons to be much better for settlement. Elbe was sure that from now on the powers that be in the Republic would be much more cautious in settling new colonies. Thank you so much for listening to Astra Imperia, Episode 2, Growing Pains. Be sure to tune in next week for the second episode of Adrift, which is the Star Trek Living campaign that is set in the original series. Thank you so much.